Hello there, my name's Salamander, and for a pretty long time now, I've been a playtester for the game Trench Crusade. I started during the original exclusive Kickstarter playtest, and have been playing the game regularly ever since. However, as of writing this video, the game is currently in an open beta state, and the game's final Kickstarter is going to be starting in about a month. This means there's going to be a lot more people who are new to this game/setting, and frankly, I consider myself something of an expert on the topic. So, who else ought to make a video shepherding you all into the trenching and/or crusading magic of this wonderfully weird, grimdark little game? This video is going to be a semi-organized rant telling you all of the reasons why you should play Trench Crusade, as well as a lot of biographical information on the game's setting and factions. In other words, this is just an excuse for me to tell you all of the reasons why I love Trench Crusade. You could even say that this video is about why Trench Crusade is so great.
Trench Crusade is the best game ever made, and anyone who says otherwise is wrong. The best thing about Trench Crusade is the art. Look at the muscularity. Look at this. Look at this. How could you not want to play as this? Jesus Christs. All 7 of them. The best thing about Trench Crusade is the miniatures. They don't exist. Oh, shit!
What? You thought I was joking? No, we're actually gonna go point for point. Kick your feet up, get some popcorn, or better yet, get any other snack, because I don't know who normalized the idea that popcorn is the ideal snack for watching anything when it crunches so goddamn loud every single time you eat some that it drowns out the thing you're actually watching. Regardless, just get yourself comfortable and be prepared for a bit of a long ride. So, to start, Trench Crusade is carried first and foremost by its visual aesthetic and its art, all done by the wonderfully talented Mike Francina. Mike Francina is a freelance concept artist who one might describe as a veritable video game industry icon. He was a concept artist for Warhammer Online Age of Reckoning back when he worked for Mythic Entertainment. While working at Mythic, he also worked on Torchlight and Torchlight 2, before moving on to being the senior concept artist at Blizzard Goddamn Entertainment. However, for reasons that have surely been lost to history, he left Blizzard, and since then has just been a freelance concept artist, working on games like Path of Exile, and the game we're talking about, Trench Crusade. The best way I can describe Francina's art for this game is that it has a kind of disturbing realness to it. Whereas a lot of, say, 40K artwork takes on this larger-than-life aspect, Trench Crusade's art is always grimly grounded in the horror of the situation. It's as evocative as it is confronting. I have no idea if I'm reading too much into it, but I noticed that not a lot of Trench Crusade art depicts battles. Whereas a lot of other grimdark sci-fi tabletop games really like to feature overlapping fields of fire and the brutal carnage of senseless melee combat, there's a certain stillness to the art in Trench Crusade. It feels like you're always taking a peek into the setting between major battles. The quiet before the storm, if you will. This makes the art of Trench Crusade have a much more still and contemplative tone. And in doing so, the horror of what's being depicted in the actual art can't get lost in the valorous spectacle of massed combat. That's what I mean when I call it confronting. You're never invited to look at any of the characters displayed in any of this art as heroic. Visual language is never used to imply that one side are the good side, or that one represents the light, where the other represents darkness. It truly paints a picture of a war where no one's winning. Not even because of the canonical stalemate between the forces of hell and the forces of the faithful that's going on in the actual universe, but also because both sides are so obviously evil that regardless of who wins, we lose. Every piece of art for Trench Crusade is, as my friend once described, a visual tragedy. But it's also kind of metal, isn't it? Grimdark as a genre is essentially the intersecting point on a Venn diagram between tragedy and metalness. And Mike Francina straddles this very thin line beautifully. For all the visual tragedy and contemplative horror in Mike Francina's art, it also manages to be fucking sick. You see this group of Christian cultists who intentionally contract leprosy as a form of self-flagellation, and your immediate reaction is, ugh. But then you look at it for a little bit longer, and then you're like, hell yeah! And then you want to play as them. The art of this setting is incredible. It's the thing that gets most people in the door. But frankly, it's not what keeps them there. After all, if you were just in it for the art, you could just look through Mike Francina's ArtStation account and then go about your day. The thing that keeps people engaged in Trench Crusade as a game is the setting. And, I mean, obviously, the game part. But before we delve into the game itself, I want to give a bit of information on the lore. Now you know how fucking sick this setting is from a visual perspective. I think it's time you found out the context behind these radical as hell images of incomprehensible horror. Right, so Trench Crusade's lore is a bit more complicated to discuss than other grimdark wargames, because Trench Crusade is explicitly an alternate history. So your understanding of the setting is also very heavily influenced by your understanding of the history it's diverging from. So even though the canonical year in Trench Crusade is 1914, we actually have to go a bit further back to 1081. And yes, this is going to be a brief history lesson. No, don't worry, please bear with me. This will help paint a really interesting picture of the setting as a whole. Right, so 1081. The Byzantine Empire is in a war with the Seljuk Turks, and to put it lightly, they're losing. The Seljuk Turks won a decisive victory at the Battle of Manzikert. And to keep a very long story short, exploited a lot of internecine conflicts within the Byzantine Empire and a succession crisis to quickly grab a ton of Byzantine territory. These civil conflicts within the Byzantine Empire finally ended when Emperor Alexios Komnenos took the throne. His first order of business after getting the throne was to request aid from the Catholic Church, requesting they send an army of veteran soldiers to aid them in their war against the Seljuks. In response, Pope Urban II, declared a war to retake Jerusalem, which is critically not actually what Alexios Komnenos I, actually asked for. See, what Komnenos actually wanted was for the Pope to basically bribe a bunch of Christian lords to send armies to go help fight the Seljuk Turks while he worked to stabilize his own realm. But Pope Urban II saw a chance for a bit of a power play here. See, at the time, the Catholic Church was not exactly the most stable of political organizations. Pope Urban II was contending with two major powers, the first being the anti-Pope Clement III, and the second being the Eastern Orthodox Church. The short version is that the Holy Roman Emperor at the time didn't really like the Pope that much, and so decided that actually Clement III was Pope. This meant, among many things, that Pope Urban wasn't even allowed inside Rome. And the Eastern Orthodox Church some 30 years ago basically just decided to stop being a part of the Catholic Church in an event known as the East-West Schism of 1054. However, Pope Urban II believed that by declaring a holy war to retake Jerusalem, he could kill two birds with one stone. First, he'd be establishing political pressure in the East that might force the Eastern Orthodox Church to rejoin the fold. And secondly, by taking Jerusalem, he would be cementing himself as the true legitimate pope. After all, what could be a greater sign of God's favor than being the one to raise the banner of Christ over the walls of Jerusalem? As such, he declared that it was the holy duty of all Christian lords to go, die of heat stroke in the desert for the glory and honor of the Catholic Church. And so they did. Though a bunch of being charitable, lightly armed peasant mobs whipped up into a fervor by a certain guy called Peter the Hermit decided to get a head start in the whole crusading business in an event known as the People's Crusade. Now, you might be thinking, pinko commie scum that I am, God, this must be fucking great, right? I love the people. But no, not this time. You see, these people wanted to get to crusading early, and they didn't want to wait for all the lords and kings and princes who commanded the more professional, well-trained armies to get their affairs in order before they could go out and make war. So they just packed up what they could and started marching towards Constantinople. What could go wrong? Everything. Everything, actually. Everything went wrong from about the moment they stepped out the front door. 'Cause you see, getting to Constantinople, takes a while. Like, the People's Crusade started in France, and, Constantinople, that's a long way to walk. And so, eventually, these people got really bored in and around the Rhineland. And crusading is really just about killing the enemies of Christ, right? And, they're in Central Europe in the medieval ages. They're surrounded by enemies of Christ. The Jews. This manifested primarily in mobs of religious maniacs sacking the German countryside, specifically targeting Jewish communities in a series of what can only be described as mass murders known as the Rhineland massacres. If we go through every instance of people's crusaders just burning down random Jewish ghettos that had the misfortune of being between them and the Holy Land, we would actually literally be here all day. So instead, I'll just put it into perspective that even at the time, these attacks were considered way beyond the pale and were widely condemned by the actual Catholic Church. You know, the organization that at the time fully believed that Jews were all collectively guilty for the murder of Jesus Christ. Yeah, even the Catholic Church thought that these guys had to fucking chill. So clearly, these guys aren't really representative of the actual crusade, right? Like, once that gets started, none of this will happen, you know? Yeah, no, not at all. When the First Crusade properly launched, it was led by a bunch of lords and knights and men-at-arms and all that good stuff. A much more professional, well-regulated army. I'm sure the Jewish population of the city that they're liberating from the evil Muslims are in safe hands. Anyway, the legitimately papal-sponsored crusade armies, known as the Prince's Crusade, proceeded to pillage and loot across the Balkans and Hungary on their way to Constantinople. God damn it, it happened again! Yeah, no, at this point, let's fast forward through just a bunch of history, because this is getting kind of long. So, the papal forces do a bunch of fighting, a lot more pillaging, and eventually retake the holy city of Jerusalem largely by accident. And oh hey, the Frankish section of the crusading army corral all the Jews in Jerusalem into Jerusalem's synagogue and burned it to the ground in an attempt to kill them all. Who could have seen that coming? And this is where Trench Crusade's alternate history timeline diverges from our own. And, you know, I think we need to break out All Reliable to give this the gravitas it deserves.
During the First Crusade, the armies of the Church captured the Holy City. Under the most holy of temples, the Knights Templar discovered secret vaults and within them, an ancient demonic artifact. The Templars, blinded by greed and with weakness in their hearts, fell to their knees. They had found a new lord. Seeing the unholy wisdom of which the artifact spoke, they began trafficking with devils and committing all manner of unspeakable rites. This was the first heresy. The armies of the Church retreated and Jerusalem became a depraved pit where hell and our mortal plane now bled into one. For 8 centuries, the Church has waged its crusade to take back the Holy City. The landscape has been utterly devastated, crisscrossed with thousands of miles of mud, trenches and craters. The crusade is now waged with armies wielding terrifying weaponry, and both sides conjure up supernatural beings of such immense power they are nigh unstoppable. Even with such incalculable might, the armies are at a stalemate. This is the Trench Crusade.
In this era of history, the Catholic Church was not just a religious institution. It was a political entity, deeply and directly involved in European, North African, and Middle Eastern politics. And, as I believe the history of the First Crusade thoroughly demonstrates, it was never above the mortal sin of greed. And not just greed for money, but greed for power. Pope Urban II started a war that would condemn uncounted tens or even hundreds of thousands to an early grave. For clout. The people who fought in it too were not doing so for holy or pious reasons. The First Crusade is specifically known as the Prince's Crusade because most of the Crusader armies were led by minor nobles and second sons. And when the First Crusade was over, these people cut apart the Holy Land into their own little fiefdoms that became known as the Crusader states. Bear in mind, Emperor Komnenos asked for papal aid to take back Byzantine land, not cede Byzantine land to the Catholic Church. And they actually specifically made all of the commanders of the different crusading armies take oaths that any lands that formerly belonged to the Byzantine Empire would be handed back. All of those commanders flagrantly fucking lied. And they did so because the motivating force behind the Crusades was not piety, but power. Is it any wonder, then, that the supposedly valorous and pious Crusaders immediately turned their backs on all of their nominal beliefs in order to sign their name in the Devil's Book? Trench Crusade is the story of how the medieval Catholic Church's endless, ravening hunger for land and power led them into the most holy place on earth, and in doing so, condemned every generation born after to an all too literal living hell. It's been 815 years since the sacking of Jerusalem and hell being unleashed onto the world by the Crusaders who took it. It's now 1914, and the state of global politics is basically completely different. Going through the entire timeline included in the book would be both tedious and also a bit beyond the scope of what is supposed to be kind of an introductory video. But needless to say, the world gets quickly divided between the forces of hell and the forces of the faithful. One sultan, the Sultan of Rum, unifies all the faithful of Islam under his banner after erecting a giant steel wall around his territory to keep all the demons and heretics out. Man, you could make a country out of that. The Principality of Antioch and its capital city becomes a major stronghold against the heretic legions during the initial stages of the war, but then gets blown up. Don't worry, they made a new one. Man, you could make a country out of that. The Catholic space program commences. Man, you could make a country out of... Don't. Broadly speaking, the Iron Sultanate, Trench Pilgrims, and the Principality of New Antioch represent the forces of the faithful. Representing the forces of hell are the heretic legions and the Black Grail. Now, these guys are actually really interesting. Now, before I continue, I do want to establish one thing about the heretics. The word heretic, in its actual theological definition, does not mean someone who worships a different faith. Neither does it mean someone who defects from a faith. Heretic is an actually very specific theological term that has been heavily watered down by its overuse in certain other grimdark war games. A very specific term, but also an apt one when we're talking about the heretic legions.
Heretic, noun, a person who differs in opinion from established religious dogma.
The heretic legions, critically, are not apostates. They still believe in the tenets and belief systems of Christianity. They still believe Christ died for our sins. They just have essentially an inverted perspective on what conclusions one should draw from the New Testament. The lore primer describes the heretic legions as being on a ceaseless crusade for a demented parity with their creator. They build golden calves specifically to commit idolatry. They read the Bible, they know what's in it, and frankly, they kinda think it sucks. The heretic legions fight predominantly for one reason: revenge against a god who they feel abandoned them. God sent his own son down to earth to die for our sins. And then in the intervening 1,000 years between that event and the First Crusade, how much absolution did the faithful really receive. Every generation of Christians since Paul has insisted that the second coming and the end times are going to happen within their lifetimes. How many times must a person endure broken promises, unanswered prayers, and arbitrary suffering before they throw their hands up and say, fuck it, maybe the guy downstairs will actually help me out? The Heretic Legions are still Christian. They're just Christians who hate God. And within the context of Trench Crusade's alternate history, you know, the one where the Catholic Church keeps a bunch of cloned Jesuses locked in a basement somewhere in New Antioch in order to cannibalistically feed on his flesh in order to create new super soldiers. Can you really blame them? Of course, prostrating yourself before demons and offering your body to be a vessel for their power isn't a much better deal than whatever numerous horrible fates await you should you have chosen the forces of the faithful. But they have distinctly sympathetic motivations for taking up arms against Christendom. Which isn't to say that the faithful don't have their own sympathetic motivations. I'm Jewish, after all. And you can bet your ass if a Dybbuk possesses Mordecai and makes him try to fucking eat me, I'm probably not just gonna let that happen. But once you strip away the preconceived moral attributions you've made around the symbols and aesthetics both the faithful and the heretics use, there's a lot of interesting moral nuance to be explored. The same can't be said for the Black Grail. The cult of the Black Grail are the endless zombified armies of the demon lord Beelzebub. Beelzebub, unlike the regular heretic legions, hate all creation. So they refuse to work with even other demon hosts. Instead, he perpetrates his own war against Christendom in Western Europe. Also, unlike the Heretic Legions, he does not work through mortal followers. The vast majority of his army are made up of undead mortals, afflicted by his various poxes and plagues. It's only the Plague Knights, Corpse Guard, and other elite warriors who are even technically at all sapient. And those aren't actually mortals either. They were at one point, but they are now on their way to becoming demons themselves. Along the way, they're out to infect the entire world with plagues, lots of plagues and diseases, and mutations and more plagues. It's all very Nurgle coded. You know, if Nurgle needed antidepressants. More factions are mentioned in the lore primer. In fact, I'm pretty sure as I'm writing this, but before I'm recording this, another faction has actually been added to the game. Put a picture of them on screen over here somewhere. Sorry, I didn't have enough time to include them. This video is already really long. But from my time talking to Mike Francina and Tuomas Pyrenen when I can, it seems like most of the factions mentioned in the lore primer are going to be added to the game over time. This obviously isn't a complete overview. I wasn't going to make just an audiobook version of the lore primer. Instead, I'll simply say that if you want more information about the setting, then you can find it in the description, where I've provided a link to the lore primer. With all that out of the way, now that we know who's fighting, we ought to discuss how they actually fight, right? Here we go. Sync clappers. Let me just... Oh, wait. I can do better than that. Close enough. This is the part of the video that's most liable to change, as the game is still in a beta state. A few days before writing this part of the script, Tuomas Pyrenen just kind of casually changed the way blood markers work, so just expect this part of the video to be a bit more vibes-based than anything resembling a strategy guide, because shit's just changing, man. So, with that out of the way, Trench Crusade, the game, is a tabletop skirmish game. That means both players assemble warbands of around 8 to 15 models. Players then pit those warbands against each other in small-scale, highly tactical firefights. However, this game differs from your normal skirmish war game affair in one pretty major way, and that's how rolling dice works. The way most games do it, largely because this is how GW did it in the 90s, is rolling d6s against target values. As in, to determine success on an action, you roll a d6 and then try to get at or above a certain number. Every iteration of Warhammer does this. Steel Rift does this. So does Conquest. Hell, so does Tusk. It works differently in Trench Crusade. Instead, every time your character performs an action, you just roll 2d6 and are trying to get a 7 or higher. In most games, being good at a thing, like let's take shooting for an example, modifies the target value you're trying to hit when you roll. These Custodes right here, they're really good at melee. That means when they swing and try to hit something, they only have to roll a 2 or higher to hit on 1d6. It doesn't work that way in Trench Crusade, though. Being better at something takes the form of rolling more d6s when you do that action and still trying to get a 7 or higher. So, to give a practical example, this right here is my combat engineer for my new Antioch warband. Isn't he nice? Isn't he such a cute little baby? He gets +1 to shooting. That means that when he rolls to shoot something, he rolls 3d6 and picks the 2 highest results. Lieutenants get +2 to shooting, so they roll 4d6 and pick the 2 highest. If that lieutenant is standing on high ground, he gets another d6 and rolls 5d6 and picks the 2 highest. And really, it's hard to overstate just how much this impacts the entire rest of the game. It makes everything both you and your opponent does way less reliable. Because sure, you can have a lieutenant standing on a high ground rolling 5d6 and picking the 2 highest to determine if he hits or not. You could just roll 5 2s and still just get a 4. In something like 40k, roughly how much damage any model will do to any other given model per attack is fairly consistent. Wild swings in statistical probability are fairly rare, but in Trench Crusade, the opposite is true. After rolling to hit, you roll to injure, which follows the same system, but follows this chart instead of a flat 7 or higher system. That's right. Instead of having health, every model is liable to die instantly should they ever be hit by an attack that lands a 9 or higher on 2d6. That is a 27% chance. That means something that would be considered a sure bet, like a guardsman not being able to kill a custodian in melee, is simply not as guaranteed. That yeoman over there is always just one lucky roll away from getting that bayonet into a helmet visor and braining your oh-so-fancy Plague Knight. But what happens if that miracle roll doesn't happen? There are mitigating factors, after all. Warriors with the tough special rule physically can't be killed in a single blow, and treat all out-of-action results on the injury chart as downed unless they're already down. You can also equip your warriors with armor that reduces the final result of that 2d6. Standard armor provides a -1, Heavy armor provides a -2, and the elusive machine armor, only widely available to New Antioch, gives a -3. Well, let's say you shoot someone and you roll a 5 on 2d6. The target's not dead, but instead they have 1 blood marker applied to them. Enemies receive blood markers as they take damage, and blood markers can then be spent to gain more dice on the injury roll. Note how that's not a bonus to the result, it's still just increasing the amount of dice you roll. What that means is that you're still subject to a high amount of randomness. Spending any amount of blood markers won't ever actually guarantee a kill. What this means is that Trench Crusade is a game dripping with constant tension. In other games, you can often kind of just get into the habit of going through a fast routine of quick rolling. But you can't do that in Trench Crusade. Every roll of the dice has a chance, however slight, of immediately resulting in the death of an important miniature. And within the context of a skirmish game where redundancy is a luxury instead of an expectation, that makes every swing of a melee weapon and every pull of a trigger terrifying. And this makes Trench Crusade engaging to play on a moment-to-moment basis in a way that a lot of other wargames simply aren't. It doesn't force you to pay attention by having a million rules your opponent may have blah-blahed that you need to make sure you can call them on. It makes you want to pay attention because you never know when a stray bullet might take out your biggest and baddest dude. That, to me, is the heart of Trench Crusade as a game. It encapsulates the inherent randomness and chaos of a battle. Realistically, right, it doesn't matter how elite someone is, how much cool gear they have, how many bonus dice to ranged attacks they get. They might just die. And you have to have a plan for what might happen should that one really cool elite model you spent over 200 points on just hits the floor and goes kaput within the first round. However, it's not a completely zero-sum game because the opposite is also true. Just as you can have a yeoman bayonet charge a war priest and just have that war priest die instantly, you can also have that same yeoman get shot at by 4 different models with submachine guns, anti-tank rifles, and satchel charges, and he might somehow still be standing by the end of it. Wild upsets in outcome, derived from a core rule set with a lot of variance, makes a wargame that's engaging to play on a moment-to-moment basis, while also forcing the players to adapt their strategy in real time. It's not the kind of game where you can just run a net list and kind of just turn your brain off. You need to always be thinking ahead, thinking about what might happen should your fancy models die, how you're going to make do without any given model. It makes things like critical redundancy and managing risk a more pressing element of the game's skill set. Frankly, though, this also creates a rule set that can be deeply frustrating at times. Like, it's funny the first couple times when Hans over there just somehow miraculously survives despite spending the entire game getting cudgeled upside the head by demons. But once you start losing entire games because of this, admittedly, it can get kind of annoying. 'Cause, frankly, it's just not fully possible to work around. Give a model as many bonuses as you may want, there's still a possibility for them to just roll all ones and still fail. It goes from hilarious and tee-hee funny to honestly being a kind of drinking game style moment. However, if you're willing to put up with a little frustration in moments like these, I think you'll find that Trench Crusade is an amazing game. It's probably not the ideal game if you're looking to be some kind of epic, hardcore, competitive gamer, but at the same time, it's really not what the game is trying to be. Like, if you're trying to get into competitive Trench Crusade as a replacement for chess, you're just setting yourself up for disappointment. Let's just look beyond the implications of the dice system. The list building itself is just incredibly fun. Individual soldiers can be basically equipped to your heart's content. According to page 14 of the playtest rules, each warrior may carry one firearm and one pistol, or 2 pistols. In addition, they may carry one two-handed melee weapon, or one single-handed melee weapon and a trench shield, or 2 single-handed melee weapons. This means there's 6 different total combinations of possible equipment slots. Except then you also get to pick which of the actual specific items you use to fill each of those equipment slots. So really you have functionally hundreds or even thousands of different possible war gear combinations, all for just one miniature. That doesn't even mention the fact that you can just give any model as much equipment like gas masks, grenades, med kits, entrenching tools, fucking banners as you may want. Of course, though, you have to be smart about which kinds of units you choose to invest in. I mean, go back up just a couple of minutes and we were just talking about how easy it is for models to just kind of die randomly. Do you really want to spend hundreds of points on giving a bunch of equipment to a yeoman or a heretic trooper? It doesn't make much sense to spend a ton of points on equipment of an Azeb, but a Yuzbasi captain? Yeah, he's probably going to be able to make his points back before he dies. At least, on average. And that ought to be your greatest concern during list building. If you're spending points on a warrior, how likely are they to be able to make those points back? You should only spend 165 points on a unit you think has a higher than average likelihood of killing 166 points of enemy models. Preferably even more. The more points worth of enemy warriors a friendly warrior can kill before going down is a concept competitive wargamers refer to as points efficiency. And especially in a game like Trench Crusade, where warriors can be killed so easily, it's a necessary thing to understand if you want to get good at the game and start winning games consistently. But also, if you just want to futz around with a really loose list building system and play Kit Bash Barbie dress up, then yeah, you can and should also do that. There really is something for everyone here. I mean, unless you like tanks, I guess. I spent a lot of time giving specific credit to Mike Francina while talking about the art of Trench Crusade. So I also want to take a while to acknowledge the fact that Trench Crusade as a game is primarily the handiwork of legendary tabletop game designer Tuomas Pairinen. I hope I'm saying your name right. I'm sorry if I'm not. He's a Finnish game designer who's most well known for being the genius behind Mordheim. He was also the design supervisor at Games Workshop throughout the 90s and early 2000s, which is when a lot of people believe GW put out some of their best work. He also has a design credit on Realm of Chaos Slaves to Darkness, which is how you know he's fucking hardcore. And that essence of late 90s wargaming is felt all throughout Trench Crusade. It can be seen through its, frankly, often aggressively zero-sum interactions, and oftentimes somewhat imprecise but very flavorful rules. It's become one of my favorite skirmish wargames, and the one I keep returning to the most. And that's saying something, because I love skirmish games. So now we've talked about each component element of Trench Crusade. The art, the lore, and the game itself. But the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. All of these aspects come together to create a singular, cohesive work of interactive art. And rarely have I ever seen a tabletop game where all 3 of these core aspects work together in the way that they do in Trench Crusade. And fuck, I just need to dedicate a whole segment to this. Welcome to my concluding statements. I have a hot take. Most tabletop games have the exact same problem, just in differing specific variations. Let's use D&D as an example. Now, I make jokes a lot about not liking D&D, but that's not really true. I like D&D fine. My issue with D&D is primarily that it refuses to fully commit to being a setting-agnostic fantasy game, but also doesn't fully commit to trying to replicate the feeling of existing within Forgotten Realms or Eberron or anywhere else. The game both fails to account for the rules and tactile feeling of existing within its setting, and fails to achieve a level of genericness to where it's easy to transplant your own setting over it. The setting and rules of a tabletop game ought to work in tandem with each other and help emphasize each other. Trench Crusade is legitimately one of a very small handful of games that I think has nailed this completely perfectly. Everything from the game's art to the lore, to the game itself, works together in a way that not many other games can claim. The game's unpredictable and swingy damage system puts you in the headspace of a grim forever war. By the end of most games, both players will have effectively tabled each other, with the winner often being the person who lost the least rather than who won the most. Just like in the lore! Canonically, the heretics and the faithful have spent the last 800 years taking turns wiping out each other's armies almost to a man. And it never makes a difference. It never matters. It never changes what happens tomorrow or the day after. The battles you play out on the tabletop are insignificant blips of sudden extreme violence that ultimately pushes neither side forward. Millions will die so that the two sides can claim to have conquered the same 50 feet of ground they lost yesterday. And the art perfectly establishes a world whose aesthetics are firmly rooted in body horror as a kind of extreme exemplification of the horrors of trench warfare. Both the faithful and the heretical utilize similar aesthetics, deploying flesh-crafted abominants, zealot warriors, and legions of damned conscripts and slave fighters. This enhances the feeling that the heretics and the faithful are homoousian, one and the same. It's not a question of good or evil, it's a question of what flavor of evil you find the most palatable. It's kind of astonishing just how much each of the constituent elements of the game flows together like this. It is extremely rare to find a game whose setting, rules, and art all work together this seamlessly. All of it feeds into each other in a way that makes Trench Crusade feel like a singular artistic work rather than a game, an art book, and a novel series that all kind of exist separately from each other. I think Trench Crusade might be one of the greatest games of all time. And it's not even technically out yet? It's hard to put into words why I love this game so much. Which is why I've written so many goddamn words about it. But now, I pass the baton to you. You've sat through an hour-long video about Trench Crusade. You now basically have to play it, right? No, actually, you will play it. I am no longer asking. Play Trench Crusade. Go down to the link in the description. The rules are free. By the time this video comes out, the Kickstarter should either be already live or is about to be. Go play it. I'll wait. Go. Come on. I'm not leaving until you go down there. I'm not doing it. You're in my house. You can't escape me. Come on. Do it. Do it. Do it. Do it. Do it!
All solace, all beauty, all is stripped away. Once the storm is safe to turn and hold the concrete gray. All solace, all beauty, all is stripped away. Callous, swift, and stay. The absence of a handle leaves only clips and bits of ground. With that in color trend, there's something left to calm the mind. You're testy and overwhelmed with apathy. Ready to make me better than the touch of friendship point. Once you lost the will to live, you're no longer afraid to die. Bring the fucking bravery and cower at my feet. Nihilistic, lost all interest in preserving any just let the fuckers burn. I so leave me in my hate. All solace, all beauty, all is stripped away. Once the storm is safe to turn to gold and concrete gray. All solace, all beauty, all is stripped away. Callous, swift, and stay.